Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a world, right, where climate change is forcing millions from their homes. But what if there's just no official legal protection for them? That's the really complex debate we're diving into today. We're focusing on the whole U.S. discussion around creating maybe a new category, like environmental refugees or perhaps climate visas. Our mission, as always, is to get you quickly up to speed on this critical issue using the sources you provided.
And yeah, that legal gap you mentioned is exactly where we have to start. The kind of shocking reality is that under current U.S. immigration law, and even the big one, the 1951 Refugee Convention, there just isn't a specific visa or refugee category for people displaced mainly or directly by climate change.
Nothing specific.
No. The definition that exists, it focuses on, persecution.
Right.
Reasons like race, religion, nationality, political opinion, being part of a certain social group. Climate change, it just doesn't neatly fit into those boxes.
Wow. So you could have these huge humanitarian crises unfolding, but like no formal pathway into the U.S. for those affected. That seems like a massive disconnect.
It really is. The closest thing the U.S. has right now is something called Temporary Protected Status, or TPS. Now, this can be granted to people who are already in the U.S. if conditions back home, say after a hurricane or during a severe drought, mean it's not safe to return.
Okay, so it helps people already here.
Exactly. But it's temporary, right? It doesn't lead to a green card, and maybe most importantly, it doesn't apply to people trying to enter the U.S. after a disaster hits their home country. It's a stopgap, really.
So yeah, these temporary fixes clearly aren't enough. What's the main sort of more permanent idea being talked about then to bridge this gap?
Well, there's a definite push from advocacy groups and some lawmakers, too, to create a completely new formal immigration pathway, specifically for climate-displaced people.
And I know one key piece of legislation that kind of embodies this is the Climate Displaced Persons Act, the CDPA, introduced by Senator Markey and Representative Velasquez. It sort of sketches out a possible framework.
That's the one. The CDPA suggests specific visa programs. It tries to differentiate between sudden disasters, like hurricanes, and the slower ones, like sea level rise, making land unusable over time.
That makes sense. Different situations.
Right. And it also talks about setting an annual number of these visas, an allocation, and getting the U.S. government to have a coordinated strategy on climate displacement overall.
Okay, but a proposal like that, it must spark some pretty intense debate, right? What are the big sticking points?
Oh, absolutely. Probably the biggest hurdle, and also where critics worry about, potential abuse, is just defining who exactly counts as a climate refugee.
How so?
Well, it's incredibly difficult, legally speaking, to prove that climate change is the sole reason someone had to move. Usually, environmental pressures are tangled up with economic problems, maybe political instability, someone fleeing just the drought, or the lack of jobs that the drought made worse. Causation versus correlation. It gets tricky.
Yeah, I can see that. And that difference you mentioned between the sudden hurricane and the slow onset stuff, like
Yeah.
the farmer whose land gradually becomes unfarmable, that really highlights the problem, doesn't it?
It does. A hurricane is pretty clear cut, right? Forced displacement. But that farmer, over 10 years,
Yeah.
is that forced migration? Or does it start to look more like an economic choice, even if driven by environmental change? It blurs the lines.
How does the proposed law handle that blurriness?
That's one of the major challenges they're trying to figure out. And, it's also important to remember something like over 90% of people displaced by climate events. They actually move within their own countries. They become IDPs, and internally displaced persons.
Right, so this international visa debate is really about a smaller fraction.
Exactly. A small but still significant and very complex fraction who cross borders, often as a last resort. And critics worry that this ambiguity in defining why they cross could make any formal visa system vulnerable to fraud.
Okay, so defining who qualifies is tough. What about the next big question, if we can define them? Who's actually responsible for, well, hosting them?
Yeah, the burden-sharing question. There are basically two main lines of argument here. On one side, you have proponents of climate visas, often making the climate justice argument. They say, look, industrialized nations like the U.S. produce the most historical emissions, so they have a kind of moral responsibility to help those now facing the consequences.
Okay, the moral responsibility angle, what's the main counter to that?
The counter often leans on what you might call the states' rights or sovereignty argument.
Right.
It emphasizes the current international legal view. A person's own government has the primary responsibility to protect its citizens. So from this perspective, international aid should focus more on helping countries build resilience at home, better infrastructure, adaptation measures to prevent displacement in the first place, rather than setting up pathways for people to leave.
So building resilience versus creating visas.
Pretty much. And you see this tension even in international agreements, like the UN's Global Compact for Migration. It acknowledges climate change as a driver of migration, sure, but it stops short of actually assigning legal responsibility to specific countries for hosting people. It encourages more of a shared, global approach.
Right. So looking at the bigger picture then, is this ultimately a shared global responsibility we all need to figure out together?
That's definitely how the conversation is framed globally. Proponents of the U.S. creating a climate visa argue it would show leadership. It could set a precedent, maybe provide a more orderly system than just reacting to crises.
But unilateral action always has potential downsides. What are the fears on the other side from those against the U.S. creating these visas alone?
The big concern is creating a pull factor. That if the U.S. acts alone, it might encourage large-scale migration towards the U.S. without any international agreement on how to share the financial and social costs involved. So opponents often argue the focus should stay on international cooperation, things like climate finance, adaptation support through existing UN bodies, like the Framework Convention on Climate Change, working together, basically.
So it's really clear that this idea of climate visas in the U.S., it faces some pretty massive challenges, legal ones, political ones, even just defining the terms.
Absolutely. Ultimately, this whole debate is really pushing the boundaries of our existing immigration law. It forces us to ask some fundamental questions, doesn't it? Like, what does a rapidly changing planet mean for how we understand justice or responsibility, or even just the basic concept of home in the 21st century? And maybe something for you, the listener, to think about is, how do you think we should define who is truly forced to move in this new era? What stands out to you?